Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf Mem Zion. We are literally at the very top of Mem Zion Amud Aleph. Let me share my screen and we'll fully get started. Yesterday, or the last few days, we've been discussing the relationship between the two shlamim lambs that are offered on Shavuot and the accompanying two loaves of bread. Yesterday, we saw that the slaughter of the shlamim sanctifies the two loaves of bread and causes the animals and loaves to be essential to one another. And so, but as we pick up at the top of Mem Zayin Amud Aleph, the Gemara quotes a brisa that addresses the sanctification of the loaves if the blood of the shlamim is thrown with the wrong sacrifice in mind. So again, the Gemara is going to quote a brisa that details a debate about the importance of throwing the blood properly to the sanctification of the bread. Tanu Rabbanim, kivsei atzeres, the lambs on Shavuot, meaning those that are the shlamim, ein mikadshin es alechem ela b'shchita. They will only create the sanctification through the slaughter. Ketzad, how does that happen? Shchatan be'lishman, v'zarak daman lishman. If you both slaughter them for the right purpose and you throw the blood for the right purpose, Kadash halechem, the bread becomes sanctified. Second line in Rashi, and keep your finger on Rashi because we're going to go through a couple. Es halechem mutter ba'achila, and that's how you can then eat the bread. Okay, without that sanctification, you can't eat the bread because the bread was purchased with communal funds from the temple's treasury, and that those funds are subject to me'ila. You can't just use them for private purposes. Shchatan shalolishman, v'zarak daman shalolishman. If you did not do anything for the right purpose, meaning you slaughtered the animals not thinking about a shlomim, but thinking about some other animal, and you threw the blood for the reason thinking about some other animals, lo kadash alechem, the bread is not sanctified, as Rashi tells us. The lo tafis pidyono b'kedushas shtei halechem, and the nature of its potential redemption is not going to be defined as two breads, meaning as the holiness that's associated with the shtei alechem. Ela b'kedushas shar, and take a look at the yod, shar trumas halishka. It is just a monetary kedusha. It is essentially not kedushas haguf, it's rather kedushas mamon. Ubetoras kahanim, and in the Midrash on Sefer Vayikra, Yalif la mikarbano al zevach, and here the word should be changed again, looking at the Shita Mikubet as Todas Shlamav, that because of you bring it on the you bring the bread with the Toda Shlamav, with the Toda of its offering. Magid, it tells us. Now, this is about the Toda offering, but the same concept applies. We're learning from Toda to other categories. Magid she'im nizbach shelo l'shem Toda. If you slaughter the sacrifice of the Toda, not for the purpose of a Toda, lo kiddush lachmo, the bread of the Toda does not become sanctified. The kivse atzeres de mikodshe lechem mitoda, and we learn from the El Nazir Gamrinan, and we learn about how the lambs on Shavuot create holiness for the bread, sanctify the bread from the Toda and the ram of the Nazir. That's how we learned it over the last 2 days. And so as a result, that's going to be, the point is that if you don't have the right sacrifice in mind when you bring the lambs on Shavuot, the bread will not change its sanctification from being monetary sanctification to kedushas haguf, to being sanctified in its physical essence. And so, as a result, that's that's going to have a ramification. All right, now third category, right? So the first category was you do everything properly, then of course it becomes sanctified. If you don't do anything properly, then it does not become sanctified at all. Middle case, shchatan lishman, you slaughter it properly. V'zarak daman shelo lishman, and then you throw the blood not for the right purpose. Halechem kadosh ve'eno kadosh. Divrei Rebbe. Rebbe says that the bread is sanctified and not sanctified. Now, what in the world does that mean? We are about to see a debate between Abaye and Rava on that particular topic. And that was why I got confused in our pre-recorded conversation. Okay, so
But we're not. He doesn't. They don't. He doesn't fulfill his chovah, does he?
no, certainly not going to fulfill his chovah. That is correct. Rabbi Lazar, but Rabbi Shimon Omer, laolam eino kodosh. Really, it's not sanctified at all. Ad sheyishchot lishman, until you slaughter it with the right intention. V'yizruk daman lishman. You have to do both with the right intention. Okay, so hold on. Okay, so my time of the Rebbe. What is Rebbe's reasoning? Why does he say it's partially sanctified and partially not sanctified? Diktiv, because it says with respect to the Nazir's offering, the Nazir's ram, and again, as Rashi highlights, we learn the halachot associated with the lambs on Shavuot from the rams of the Nazir, because as we saw the other day, that the rams of the Nazir, like the lambs on Shavuot, are brought with a variety of other korbanot, with korbanei chatas and korbanei olot. And so, as a result, the fact that the El Nazir is the aisle, only the shlamim is what sanctifies the bread that goes with it. That's how we know that similarly on Shavuot, it is just the shlamim sacrifices that sanctify the bread, the shtei alechem. So now, though, we're going to cite a pasuk, and Rebbe's going to use it to say that it teaches us that there's some sanctification even with slaughter alone, and Rabbi Lazar ben Rabbi Shimon is going to say no. That same pasuk teaches us that there's no sanctification until you do everything correctly. So here's the pasuk. Diksiv. Again, this pasuk is Bamidbar Perek Vav pasuk Yud Zayin. Ve'es ha'ayil ya'aseh zevach shlamim la'Hashem al sal hamatzos. That you're going to the ram, he's going to make as a zevach, as a sacrifice for a shlamim to Hashem, with the basket of unleavened loaves. So lamemra deshchita mekadsha. The implication is that the zevach, the slaughtering, because the word zevach, in addition to being a noun that refers to the korban, also can refer to the action of the slaughtering. So as a result, it is the slaughtering that sanctifies everything, because it's the zevach, the slaughtering, that makes it a shlamim to Hashem. Rabbi Lazar ben Shimon. So now what about Rabbi Lazar ben Shimon? How does he understand this verse in order to say that there's no sanctification whatsoever? Yaseh. The pasuk also says Yaseh, implying an action. Ad sheyaseh kol asiyosab. You have to do everything that's required. So, Rebbe Nami Haksiv Yaseh. But 1 second, Rebbe also sees that it says Yaseh. The pasuk says Yaseh Zevach. So Iktiv Zevach Yaseh. So Rebbe would respond, the reason that I don't give Rebbe Lazar's interpretation is because it does not say Zevach Yaseh. If it did say Zevach Yaseh, I would agree with Rebbe Lazar. Iksiv Zevach Yaseh Kidde Ka'amrat. It would be exactly like you said, because we have the slaughter and then a Yaseh and then an action, suggesting that there's some action, as Rashi puts it. Yaseh Zev. 1 second. Iktiv Zevach Yaseh, because if it said Zevach Yaseh, mashma falgaf de zevach boy asia achrisi. Once you do the slaughtering, there still is some action that's still to be required. But
That's the
hush,
bread.
what?
And that would be the bread,
No,
right?
that would be the throwing of the blood.
Oh, throwing of the blood. Okay.
Right, the throwing of the blood in the proper manner would be the second action. Dixiv ya, but hashda dixiv yaseh zevach. But now that it says that the yaseh zevach in the other order, bameh yaseh, what is it telling us? It's what action is it that you need to do? Bizvicha. It is the zvicha. It is the slaughtering. Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon, Haksiv Zebach. So in second, though, it does say Zebach, according to Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon, and yet he says that it doesn't get sanctified until you've done everything, until even the blood has been thrown properly. Hahumi boile, look at the Rabbi Yochanan. Now that's what you need, Rabbi Yochanan. That word Zebach is to teach us what Rabbi Yochanan taught us. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Hakol modim shitzaru sheyehei lechem b'shas shchita. Everybody agrees that in order for the lechem, the shtei lechem, to be valid, they need to exist already at the time that you are slaughtering the shlamim. And if they don't exist, you have not fulfilled. Even if you bring them later, that does not work for the purpose of bringing shtei halechem. So that is the basics of the machlokes between Rabbi Lazar and Rebbe. Now, though, we're going to go back and ask the question, and as we're right now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 lines down in the Gemara, last two words on the line.
So you need three acts. There are three components. There's the shchita, the zrikat adam, and the lechem.
Correct. And right now you need you need to do the first two in order to sanctify fully the bread. That without the first two being done correctly, whatever bread you have is not totally sanctified. So now the Gemara asks the question: when Rebbe said kadosh ve'eno kadosh, what did he mean? My kadosh ve'eno kadosh. What does it mean to be sanctified but not sanctified? So we have a machlokas between Abaye and Rava. Abaye Amar kadosh ve'eno gamur. It's sanctified, but it's not completely sanctified. Rava Amar kadosh ve'eno nitar. No, it is completely sanctified. We just don't let you. We just say it's not permitted, meaning it's not permitted for the Kohanim to eat. So my beinayu, because after all, remember, even though Rava says it's not completely sanctified, even before the sanctification process, it's already prohibited to eat. So everybody is going to be agreeing that it's prohibited to eat. So what is the practical difference between Rava and Abaye? So my beinayu, ika beinayu limit pas pidyono. The situation is whether or not the bread can be redeemed onto money in a way that the money becomes kadosh. Now, the wording of the Gemara in the next few words, Rashi has a real problem with. Although Rashi offers an interpretation, if we take a look, Rashi says, last of the narrow lines in Rashi, this is not the beginning of the Divrei Maskell, but Dahaki Lefikach. Well, actually, if we go, his language is even clearer. Actually, if you go to the beginning, in the medium wide lines of Rashi, near the end of the fifth wide line, it says "V'zeh shepirashti tchila." My original interpretation, which matches the language that we have in our Gemara, shibush gamorhu. It is a complete mistake, as I explained above. And so rather than go through both interpretations, we are just going to follow the latter interpretation. And it moves the word lo from the Abaye statement to the Rava statement. So Abaye toughest pidyono, and Rashi and Larava low toughest pidyono. So what exactly does that mean? That so literally the translation is according to Abaye, the redemption is invested, meaning it does get sanctity, and according to Rava, it does not. And here's the explanation. Let's take a look at Rashi. It's in the middle of a longer Rashi. So take a look, second to last. It's the last abbreviation on the last line in the narrow lines of Rashi on Mem Zayin Amud Aleph. Dehagi Garsinam, the Lashon Hagonhu. Here's the proper language. La'abaye toughest pidyono, u'larabba lo toughest pidyono. And now Rashi goes on to explain what that means. Le'abaye da'amar eno gamor adayin lo chala alav kedushas haguf gemura. So according to Abaye, where it's not a complete sanctification, the sanctification of the bread after you do the shechita is not a kedushas haguf. It does not get full sanctification of itself. And it's important to note that something that has kedushas haguf is no longer capable of being redeemed for money. As long as it has that kedushas haguf, it's no longer redeemable for money. But something that does not have kedushas haguf and only has kedushas mamon is a value. Its value is what's holy. So then you can redeem it onto something else. So va'akasi shayach be pidyon. So as a result, because it does not have a kedushas haguf, Rashi continues, and we're now on the third medium Y line, beginning of the line. It is capable of being redeemed. V'nehid de kedusha say shchita b'mikzas delo nafik l'chulin. And the point is that when we say that the slaughtering it causes it to become sanctified, it's telling us that it does not go out to become unsanctified even when you do the redemption. So umihu akati mechusar gamar kedusha v'shayach be kedusha's damim litvos pidyono. But at the same time, it is not a complete kedusha. So as a result, when you try to redeem it, you are able to do so. But kedusha and now. So here we have, again, let's go through the example. We have the loaves. We slaughter it correctly, the animal correctly, and then the blood gets thrown for the wrong carbon. And so now what happens to these loaves? If I take them and I say, I want to redeem them onto these coins that are worth at least as much. And so as a result, those coins, according to Abaye, are sanctified, and if you were to use them, you have performed me'ilah. You would have violated the Torah's. If you use them by accident, you would have violated the Torah's prohibition of using something that belongs to the Beis Hamikdash without permission. On the other hand, L'Rava, and now again we're on the 1 to 5th line of the Rashi, in the medium wide lines of Rashi. L'Rava, Da'amar Kadosh Gamar Kedushas Haguf, he says that it is completely Kadosh, and therefore it is completely sanctified and has its physical essentiality has become sanctified. And so as a result, lo shayach be pidyon. There is no possibility to redeem it. V'im hitfis mos bepidyono. And if I now try to take money and I say I want to redeem these loaves of the shtei alechem onto these coins, eina nitfasin. These coins are not sanctified, and they do not become holy, and they do not become subject to me'ilah. Dechevan de'eno yotze mikadusha because the bread never loses any aspect of its sanctification, because it is a sanctification of its physical essence. So eno yotze mikadusha klal doesn't lose any of it. Ezo kedusha tachol b'pidyono. There is no holiness that could go on these coins any longer. And so as a result, that is the debate. So now that we understand this debate, again, the question is whether if we try to redeem the bread on something else, will it actually do any work? And according to Abaye, the answer is yes. According to Rava, the answer is no. Well, now Bishlam ala Rava Hainu deika bein Rebbe Elazar v'Rebbe Shimon. If we ask the question, what's the practical difference between Rebbe Elazar and Rebbe Shimon? Remember, according to Rebbe Elazar, there's no sanctification on the bread, and according to Rebbe, there's sanctification, but it's not sanctified. But according to both of them, you're not going to be able to eat it. It's just the reason that's different. According to Rebbe Elazar, the son of Rebbe Shimon, you can't eat it because it still has the original monetary holiness, and according to Rebbe, as understood by Rava, it would have full holiness in its essence. So as a result, there's a clear difference between the two of them. It's the exact difference that is between Rava and Abaye within the interpretation of Rebbe. That according to Rava Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, would allow the redemption to take place, and there would be kedusha on the redeemed coins. And according to Rebbe, it would not have any kedusha on the redeemed coins. But according to Ela Abaye, Ma'ika bein Rebbe Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon. But according to Abaye, what difference is there? According to both of them, there's not full bodily sanctification on the bread. And so as a result, if you were to both of them would agree that if you try to do a redemption, the coins get some holiness and it would be effective. So what is the difference between them? So the Gemara answers, Ika beinayu ipsule biyotze. You know what? The question is, if all you have is monetary kedusha, well, then there is no prohibition to take those loaves outside the Beit Hamikdash. There's no prohibition because all those loaves have is monetary kedusha. But according to Rebbe, as Abaye understood it, there is some aspect of kedusha that has been adopted or applied to these loaves as a result of the shechita. And therefore, because now the shechita does have some effect, if you were to take those loaves outside the Beis Hamikdash, you would end up with those loaves being invalidated. And this does have a practical ramification. As Rashi tells us, if we take a look at Ika Benayah Le'ipsule B'yotze, L'Rebbe, according to Rebbe, Mifsal B'yotze, it's going to cause, if you take it outside the Beis Hamikdash, it's going to be invalidated. Im Yatza, if you were to leave the Beis Hamikdash. Lo Yehei Kasher Lishchot Alav Kvasim Acherim. And you know what you can't do? Remember, we're going to need, this is the holiday offering for Shavuot, part of the holiday offering for Shavuot. We're going to need to offer 2 new lambs. So the question is can we use the bread we already have? Well, according to Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, of course we can. There was no kedusha that was applied to it. And so as a result, even if it leaves the Beis Hamikdash, we don't need to get new bread because there was no kedusha zaguf on this bread. But according to Rebbe, if those loaves left the Beis Hamikdash, now it's too late. They've left the Beis Hamikdash, even though they've been partially sanctified. It's too late to do anything about it. And in continuing on, Rebbe Elazar, according to Rebbe Elazar, lo mifsal b'yotze. It doesn't get invalidated because it left. Shelo yarda la kedusha zaguf, because it never gained the physical essentiality of holiness. Ella, there was no holiness in its essential physicality. Ella kedusha's damim. It's just had a monetary holiness. Ve'ein yotze posel ba. And leaving the Beis Hamikdash doesn't invalidate that kedusha and doesn't affect that kedusha. V'ksherim l'shchot aleh. And so as a result, you could slaughter other animals, kvasim acherim, other lambs, instead, and of course you have to bring it back into the base of Mikdash first, but you can slaughter other lambs instead. And then he continues, as we quoted this language earlier, V'zeh Pirashi, this explanation, the first explanation that I gave, Tchila, Shibush Gamor, it's completely mistaken. And that's why I didn't go over it with you, and that's why we have just focused on the second explanation.
So we're saying with Kedusha the Guf, it isn't, then it does, let me get this. Once it acquires Kedusha the Guf, then it's subject to Me'ila, is that? Or is it the other
No,
way?
then it's subject to Yotze. Then it's subject to the prohibition of leaving the Beis Hamikdash.
So
That's
only
the
when it gets Kedusha Damim, then it would be subject to Me'ila, right?
no. Well, both Kedushas Guf and Kedushas Mammon are subject to Me'ila. So that's why we didn't raise Me'ila, because Me'ila applies to both.
I thought we did raise Me'ila.
No, I just mentioned Me'ila with respect to the coins. The coins of redemption are whether they're subject to Me'ila, because that's what matters if we say according to Rava's interpretation of Rebbe, where it is fully sanctified, the loaves get the full sanctification. If you were to try to move that sanctification and redeem it through coins, those coins would not gain any sanctification. So one of the ramifications of those coins not gaining any sanctification would be the fact that you could use them and you would not violate Me'ila. That was the only reason that Me'ila came up.
And that would be Kedusha the Guf or not Kedusha the
No, of
Guf?
course not. There would be no Kedusha whatsoever. That's why there's no Me'ila. Because you can't redeem Kedushas Haguf. And so that's why if you try to redeem Kedushas Haguf, you've done nothing. And so the coins that you used are not Kodesh at all.
Right. So, and Rava holds.
And Rava holds that when Rebbe says a kadosh ve'eno kadosh, it means it's kadosh completely, it's fully sanctified with kedushas haguf, and therefore you can't redeem it onto coins any longer.
And Abaye says it's Kedusha.
And Abaye says kadosh ve'eno kadosh means that it is only partially sanctified, and therefore it effectively has elements of both Kedushas Haguf and Kedushas Mammon, and therefore when you try to redeem it, you are successfully redeeming the Kedushas Mammon part of those loaves, because the transition from Kedushas Mammon, which is what it has as soon as the money of the community has been used to buy to purchase the loaves. As soon as that money has been purchased to purchase the loaves, those loaves now adopt or obtain the kedusha that's associated with them. This is one of the interesting things. I'll just a very quick aside. There is that one of the amazing things about work, about the power of doing something positive in the world, is the fact that it has the ability to redeem money that belongs to the Beis Hamikdash. So, for example, if you bake those loaves for the Beis Hamikdash, the Beis Hamikdash can give you money that before it's given to you, if anybody were to take it and use that money, it would be subject to Me'ila. But now the Beis Hamikdash gives you that money, which was the community's money, and using it would be subject to Me'ila, and you in turn give the Beis Hamikdash the bread. Now the bread has the holiness of that money, and the money you could do whatever you want with. That's the power of the work that you did in baking the bread. So that's the power that just highlights that the work and positive construction in the world has a tremendous power. And the same thing, of course, applies to the workers who worked in the Beis Hamikdash. You know, if you swept the Beis Hamikdash and they paid you for the sweeping, if you did construction within the Beis Hamikdash and they paid you for the construction, they would pay you with money from Hektish, and all of a sudden you had done the work, you get paid that money, magic. The money is not actually subject to Me'ila any longer. On the other hand, if they were to just give you it and you wouldn't have done anything for the Beis Hamikdash, it would be subject to Meila. There's still prohibition of Meila. So I just a quick aside because I love that concept of how positive construction in the world can have such a religiously meaningful impact in the world. But all right, so that
The
is
Gemara in Shkalim discusses this whole concept of exchange and so
yes,
forth.
yes,
The
a hundred
Mishnah,
percent. It's very
there,
relevant
which
to that.
discuss it.
All
Yeah.
right. So having
Well,
raised the
what
case,
determines here in this case when an object, whether the kvasim or the money, becomes kedusha mammon versus kedusha aguf? Well, who makes that?
well,
How is that determined?
that's precisely the debate between Rebbe and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. I'm sorry, Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon. So, according to Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, it only gets it after the blood is thrown properly, and you have to do everything properly. The blood of the shlomim is thrown properly, and according to Rebbe, it gets it at least partially as soon as you do the shchita. And the debate between Rava and Abaye is: does Rebbe say that it gets it completely? That's Rava's position, or does it get it only partially? That's Abaye's position. But according to Rabbi Lazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, you need to do the throwing also. Okay, so having raised the case of the Shavuot Shlamim being slaughtered for their own sake, but having their blood thrown not for their own sake, the Gemara addresses whether one can still eat the bread. So let's take a look. So by Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Kivsei Atzeres, Shishchatan Lishman, Vizarak Daman Shalo Lishman, Oso Alechem, Mahu Bachila. Are we allowed to eat the bread or not eat the bread when you slaughtered the animal properly, but you threw the blood improperly, not for its own sake, for a different korban? Now, remember, it's important to remember that we generally say that other than with a couple of exceptions, the Chatas and the Pesach, generally we say that the korban ends up being a valid korban. It just doesn't fulfill its obligation. So we're going to need to offer two new lambs for Shavuot, but generally the sacrifice itself is a valid sacrifice. So what do we do with the bread? Do we focus on the fact that it's not actually the shtei alechem any longer, or do we say no, it's still the shtei alechem and you can eat it, etc.? So
Maybe you burn it.
So according to whom are we asking? Because you know what? If you follow Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, ha'amar zrika hi demakacha. The only thing that sanctifies the bread is the proper throwing of the blood. We don't have that here. Therefore, there is no kedushas aguf, and therefore, what do you have? You just have kedushas mamon. Well, the kedushas mamon never left, so as a result, you cannot eat it. And iyaliba de Rebbe, ben la Abaye, ben la Rava, kadosh ve'eno niter lahu. Whether you follow Abaye's approach or Rava's approach, it's holy, and it has some aspects of Kedushas Aguf, even if according to Abaye it's not fully Kedushas Aguf, but it never had a permission. It never became permitted to eat. So who are you asking this question according to? According to the main two opinions that we've seen so far, there isn't anybody to ask that, because it's clearly going to be prohibited. Ella aliba dahaitan. You know who I'm asking like? It's like the Tana in the following brisa. And it's going to be according to Rabbi Akiva that we're going to see that this is the question. Tani avua de Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, because the father of Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba taught the following brisa: Shtei alechem, when you have the two loaves of bread on Shavuot, sheyatzu ben shchita lizrika. If it left the Beis Hamikdash between the slaughter and the throwing, so what's the status? V'zarak daman shel kvasim chutz lizmano. And now what happens is the person who throws the blood doesn't have the proper intention. Rather, he has the wrong intention. He has what is known as a pigul intention. He thinks about he thinks about the eating of the.
Isn't this pigul?
Let me finish. He thinks about the eating of the lambs, eating them not in the proper time. That is going to be the case. So again, you slaughter it properly. The bread leaves the courtyard, and now you throw the blood, but you're thinking about eating the animal at the wrong time. And so the question is, what is the status of the bread? Did the bread's leaving mean that you've done something wrong and now it can't be pigul any longer? Or is the bread leaving not a technical problem in the bread itself, and therefore, when you now have a pigul thought, not only is the pigul thought applied to the lambs, of course, but it also would apply to the bread. That's the debate that we're going to have. Did you have a question, Ken?
I've been thinking about this for about 10 minutes now. Why is there possibly a pickle issue here?
Well, now we're doing well. The question is we didn't have Piggle before now
Right.
because our non-intention was having in mind the wrong korban, having
Right,
in
but I
mind the
was
wrong
thinking, are
korban.
we going to get is somewhere here going to be a
Ah, yes. Well,
pickle?
so if you thought that, are we going to ask the question about Piggle because we haven't been discussing Piggle in a long time? Yes. The answer is yes. Rabbi Lezer Omer Ein Belecha Mishum Piggle. Rabbi Lezer says, you know what? There is no Piggle here, and we'll see why in just a moment. Rabbi Akiva Omer Yesh Belecha Mishum Piggle, and Rabbi Akiva says there is Piggle. And Amar Rav Sheshes explains the two opinions. Hani Tanai Karebi Svira Lahu. Both of these Tanaim are thinking like Rebbe, meaning that there is at least some sanctification of the guf as a result of slaughtering the shlamim correctly. Da'amar shchita makacha, because he says that the slaughtering sanctifies. Miu Rabbi Eliezer l'tamei. However, we have Rabbi Eliezer following his reasoning, because what does he say? Da'amar ein zrika mo'elis liyotze. That you know what? When you throw the blood for something that has already left, for example, if the meat has left, right? Because that can technically happen too. You slaughter the animal, the meat portion that the Kohanim are supposed to eat leaves the Beis Hamikdash, and now you throw the blood, and you throw the blood with a pigul thought. Does that throwing of the blood with the pigul thought create me'ila for the meat that left? The answer, according to Rabbi Eliezer, is no, it does not, because that zrika is not effective for anything that left its right place, and therefore there is no pigul. The Rabbi Akiva litame, and Rabbi Akiva follows his reasoning, da'amar zrika moelis liyotze, because he says that you know what, it does help with the going, Zrika does help with the going out. And so even for something that has left. And so as a result, just as the meat that went out would be subject to pigul, so too the bread that goes out is subject to pigul. And so as a result, we're going to treat the bread just like the meat, and it's going to all be subject to pigul. Ditnan, as we have the following Mishnah, is in Me'ila, and it highlights the two different opinions that we just saw. A muri kachim kalim sheyatzu lifnei zrika sadamim. If you have the sacrificial parts of kachim kalim that leave the Beis Hamikdash before the throwing of the blood, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Ein mo'alin behen. You know what? There is no me'ila. Now, what's the story with the kachim kalim? Kachim kalim are not subject to me'ila until you throw the blood. And the reason for that is because they are partially, kachim kalim, are considered partially owned by the owner of the sacrifice. And therefore, until you actually throw the blood and the emurim become dedicated to put on the mizbeach, they are considered partially owned by the owner, and therefore there is no me'ila that's associated with them. And so, according to Rabbi Eliezer, even if you were to throw the blood, if the emurim had already left the Beis Hamikdash and therefore are not kosher to put on the mizbeach, they're not going to be subject to me'ila. Ve'ein chayavin alehem mishum pigol v'nosar v'tamei. And you know what? Same thing applies for pigol, nosar, and tamei. And because if you throw the blood for something that's outside the Beis Hamikdash, that throwing of the blood doesn't work. Rabbi Akiva Omer, of course, mo'alin behen. It is subject to me'ila. Chayavin alem mishum pigol v'nosar v'tamei. And similarly, you'll be subject to pigol, nosar, and tamei. Meaning that when you throw the blood for something that is outside the proper place, that is not considered an invalidity that undermines pigul. Because remember, one of the rules of pigul is that you have to do everything else correctly. So the question is, when we say you have to do everything else correctly, it's we're referring to, you have to do everything else correctly that involves the essence of the things that you're talking about. And according to Rabbi Akiva, the leaving of the Beis Hamikdash of the thing is of whatever thing you're talking about and leaving the proper place. That is not such an undermining to make everything puzzle, even though it would be invalid. It's not sufficient to undermine the possibility of pigul. And so as a result, that is consistent. This Mishnah in Meila is exactly highlighting the positions that Rav Sheshes just said are reflected in the Brisa taught by Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Rabbi Abba.
What are we
So
talking about? A shlamim? What other kodshim? Something like that?
yeah, a kachim kalam is shlamim, a toda. There are a
Toda.
number of kachim
Right,
kalam, but
right,
that's
exactly.
what we're talking about.
But the Baal is allowed to eat it, right? Right?
Yes, that the owner is allowed to eat it. That's the whole point. That is why the fact that it's kachim kalim is, and the fact that the owner is supposed to eat it is why until you do the zrika, it's considered all one unit. And the owner has an ownership interest in it. So there is no me'ila, even if you were talking about the chalev. Even though we know that the chalev will eventually be something that you're supposed to put on the bismeyach, right now, until the blood is thrown, the chalev isn't fully ready to be put on the mizbeach and burned. And so as a result, the owner of the korban still has a general ownership interest in the entire korban. It is only after the throwing of the blood that the imurim are now effectively treated differently from the rest of the animal. The rest of the animal is now subject to being eaten, and the emurim is subject to being, it divides. The emurim is subject to be putting on the mizbeach. The eaten part are subject to being eaten. And so as a result, only now, after the blood is thrown, is there this possibility of me'ila with respect to the eaten parts. With respect to the emurim parts, though, that are supposed to go on the mizbeach.
But the eating part, but once he put, even after he puts it on the Mizbeach and burns it, he's still the owner. He gets to eat the shlamim, right?
Yes, but the ownership of the two parts becomes separate. At
Okay,
that
right.
moment, as
Okay,
soon as you throw the blood, the emurim part becomes owned by Hashem effectively and
right,
only by
right,
Hashem, and the meat part becomes owned by the owner. And so
right,
as a result, there's no me'ilah with respect to the owned part, but there
right,
would be me'ilah with respect to Hashem's part.
right.
Okay,
Okay.
so now that we did all that, the whole purpose of citing that brisa was to reference Rabbi Akiva, who says that there is pigul in that situation. And what we're going to say is my, and Rashi tells us, take a look, second line on Mem Zayin, a second narrow line on Mem Zayin on Mebet. My, Kolomar Aliba de Rabbi Akiva. According to Rabbi Akiva, here is the question that Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yitzchak is asking. Midizrikas pigul Kava lelechem befigel biyot. Now back into the Gemara, just to be clear. So we read the first three words of that Rashi on the second narrow line. We're going to go back and do the rest of that Rashi shortly, but let's first look at the question inside the Gemara, and we are right now um, uh, one, two, three, five lines down in the Gemara on Mem Zayin Amabet, middle of the line. Midizrikas pigel kaval lechem bepigel biyotze. When we have a throwing that has a pigel intention, we say that it works and affects pigel, the bread of pigel, even if it's outside the Beis Hamikdash, and it makes it pigel kivasar, so that just like the meat is pigel, so too the bread is pigel. So zrikas shelo lishma nami shar yalei lechem. So do we also say when you throw the blood, even though you threw the blood with the wrong intention, do we say that it permits the bread to be eaten? Just, and Rashi says, Mi boile Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak. So with the question of Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, my dizrikas pigel kavale lelechem bepigel, just as the pigel thought with respect to throwing caused the bread to be subject to pigel, even though that throwing was an invalid throwing, right? The throwing had in mind a pigel thought. So it was an improper throwing. It caused the sacrifice itself to be invalid. Daha yotzehu. So after all, and this left the Beis Hamikdash. The bread itself had left the Beis Hamikdash, and kava lelechem befigel ki basar, and it caused the bread to be subject to pigel, just like the meat. Kishar basar, just like all the rest of the meat. Shalo yatsa, that didn't leave. Alma lechem keguf hakvasim. So we see that according to Rabbi Akiva, the bread is treated just like the meat of the lambs. Dekihechi deguf hakvasim mepugalim, just as the body of the lamb becomes pigul and subject to the prohibition of eating it. Lechem nami mefugal. So too, the bread itself is pigul, and so now zrika shalol lishma. So when it comes to our question of throwing the blood without the proper intention, nami dipsulahi, that also is an invalid throwing. Shari lahu, we should say that it is that the bread is permitted. To hakaimalan kol hazvachim shenizbechu shalol lishman ksherim. Because even though, what do we say in the end? We say that all sacrifices that have an improper throwing are still valid sacrifices, with the exception of the chatas and the Pesach on Pesach. So as a result, we should say that it is kosher. The lechem nami keguf hakvasim adamo. And we just said that according to Rabbi Akiva, the bread is comparable to the meat. So given that we say that the meat can be eaten, because we say that if you have in mind the wrong korban and it's not a chatas, we say that it's all okay and it won't fulfill your obligation, but it's still considered a valid sacrifice. So let's allow the bread to be eaten just like we're going to allow the meat. Odilma luchum ramrinan. Or maybe when Rabbi Akiva said that we're treating it as pigul, he was just noting that we're going to be machmer, that we're going to be strict, and lakula lo amrinan, and we're not going to allow us to be lenient, and we're not going to say that and so as a result, even though you might say that the meat is treated like the bread, or the bread is treated like the meat, excuse me, we're not going to say that if it means causing something that we might have thought would be prohibited to become permitted. So
this sounds a little circular reasoning that was making the bread depending on the zrika, and the zrika is not good because of the bread. It's getting a little bit confusing. I would think
it's
it doesn't
definitely
seem
confusing,
direct.
but let's go through. So the throwing of the bread, the throwing of the, excuse me, the throwing of the blood improperly is effectively both finishing some aspect of sanctification of the bread and causing the bread to be permitted. You're absolutely, and the bread being outside, it's really just the influence is just from the throwing to the bread. The bread isn't influencing the throwing. The point is that the bread is outside. So maybe I would think that the bread is totally invalid and it's not part of the korban anymore, and you have to bring new bread. And because of the concept of ma'akvin, everything has to be done anew. But now we had this improper thought. Now again, the improper thought is about is about a korban. Is the improper, the pigul thought that we have is about the sacrifice. The sacrifice, when you have a pigul thought, we say it's still going to be a valid sacrifice because you have the right animal intended. And now it just becomes prohibited with the subject of pigul. And the question is, do we say that the pigul that applies to the meat also applies to the bread that left early? And so that's the question. And the answer, according to Rabbi Akiva, is yes, meaning that the halachas of the bread and the meat are the same. And so maybe we would say the same thing if you offer something shalol lishman, that just as the lo lishman makes the meat permitted, so too the lo lishman should make the bread permitted. So Maskif lo Rav Papa says,
Lo lishman, if we're saying if lo lishman lizman is pigul, right?
No. There's two things. There's two separate concepts. The question is about lo lishman. The question that Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak is asking is about what happens if you slaughter it for its own sake and the blood's thrown not for the own sake. What do we say that the bread is edible? The bread never left. The bread is a completely separate situation. And the question is, who is he asking this question to? And the answer is he's asking it according to Rabbi Akiva in a brisa. And Rabbi Akiva in that brisa is talking about a different concept. He's not talking about shalol lishma. He's talking about pigul. And he's talking about a situation where the bread left, and now you had a pigul thought on the shlamim. And
Right.
so as a result, the question is does that pigul thought also affect the bread? And his answer is yes. So we see that when it came to the pigul thought, the bread and the lamb and the meat have the same halacha. They're both subject to pigul. And so the question is do we say the same thing is true with respect to throwing it not for its own sake? That we say that just as the meat is kosher when you throw not for its own sake, you throw with having a different korban in mind, so too the bread is kosher when you have it in a different korban in mind. That's the question, okay? And now we're asking, Maskevlo Rav Papa. Rav Papa says, your understanding of the brisa, the machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer is wrong. Maskevlo Rav Papa, Omi Mai, Deki Isnahu, Abrai Pligi. How do you know that the situation where they're arguing, where Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva are arguing, are when the loaves are still outside? Dilma b'de isnahu abrai, de kuli alma lo pligi de ein zrikas moelas liotzi. If the bread was outside the Beis Hamikdash, everybody would agree that now when you throw with pigul, the bread is not going to be subject to pigul. Ubahadar alinhu pligi. And where do they argue? They only argue about when the loaves come back in. De Rabbi Eliezer Savar Karebi, de Amar Shchita Mekacha, that really the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva is the machlokas between Rabbi and Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon. That Rabbi Eliezer would agree with Rabbi. And he says that because the sanctification is complete, so as a result, when that loaf leaves the courtyard, it becomes pasul. And that is why even when it comes back in and the blood is thrown with a pigul thought, it's not going to be subject to pigul. But Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, Da'amar Shchita Lo Mekacha. Rabbi Akiva thinks like Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon. And when you bring it back in, it hasn't yet been sanctified, because what's going to sanctify it is the throwing of the blood. And so now when you throw the blood, the lo mivsala b'yotze, and so it never became unkosher as a result of leaving, because it never had kedushas aguf yet, and it only gets the kedushas aguf when the blood is thrown. Hi, my, 1 second. That interpretation doesn't work. And so the bottom line is that because Rabbi Eliezer would agree with Rabbi, and Rabbi Akiva would agree with Rabbi Lazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, we would be back to the situation where we have no idea who is who when Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yitzchak asks his question, who is he asking the question to? Because again, according to both Rabbi and Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, the answer is the same. The answer is that of course the bread is going to be prohibited. So, hi mai, 1 second. Amra Bishlam Rabbi Akiva Rabbi Sfira le de Amar Shchita Mekachi lahu. If you say that Rabbi Akiva agrees with Rabbi, that works because that involves the sanctification of the slaughtering, causes sanctification of the loaves. Hainu dekama Rabbi Akiva dekache lahu b'shchita. That's why Rabbi Akiva would say that when it's sanctified, the bread is sanctified with the slaughtering. V'as yazrika, and now the throwing of the blood, kavalahu b'pigul. It can create the pigul. Elai Amr to Rabbi Elazar, but Rabbi Shimon, Sfira le de Amr Zvicha lo Mekacha. If you say that Rabbi Akiva agrees with Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, well then, and so now the slaughtering does not create the sanctity, and so only the Zrika does. Zrika's pigul mi Mekacha. Does a Zrika that with a pigul intent cause sanctity? V'amar Rav Gidol, Amar Rav Gidol says in the name of Rav, Zrika's pigul eina mevia lidei mu'ila. The throwing of blood with a pigul intention does not have the effect of a traditional zrika. and meaning that it will not cause something to be subject to me'ilah. Ve'ena motzia midei me'ilah, and it won't cause something to no longer be subject to me'ilah. And what are we talking about? Well, if you talk about the kachim kalim that we talked about a little bit earlier, right? Ordinarily, when you throw the blood, now all of a sudden the meat is ready to be eaten by the owner, and the emurim are ready to be put on the mizbeach, and so now the emurim are subject to me'ilah. But what Rav Gidl is telling us in the name of Rav is that no, that emurim is not subject to me'ilah because the zrika that you did with a pigul intent is not a true valid zrika. It's an invalid zrika. And so the zrika doesn't work to make the emurim subject to me'ilah. And Eina Mevia, the Eina Motzia Midei Me'ilah Vivasar Kachim Kachim. And when we say that it doesn't cause the me'ilah to happen, to take things out of me'ilah with respect to the meat of kachim kachim. Same idea. When is it that when you have kachim kachim, which are all belong to Hashem, when is it that the Kohanim have the ability to eat the part that is supposed to go to them? After the Zrika. The Zrika changes the meat that is supposed to go to the Kohanim from being owned by Hashem to being capable of being owned to being effectively owned by the Kohanim. And so as a result, it's no longer owned by Hashem. And so as a result, according to Rav Gidl, when you throw blood and you have a pigul intent, that is not a kosher throwing, and therefore does not actually change the me'ilah status of the meat that is kachim kachim. It is still subject to me'ilah, but so as a result, it can't. There's no way that you can offer this different interpretation. The interpretation that Rav Papa offered to this brisa, which undermines the question of Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak. So that interpretation is inconsistent with Rav Gidl's teaching. So the answer is Lavi Tosif the Rav Gidl Amar Rav. Nah, you know what? The teaching of Rav Gidl in the name of Rav was refuted, and so as a result, the question that Rav Papa has is a valid question, and in the end, the question that Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, we have no idea who he's asking that question to, and we don't bother even answering the question. All right, just
why is the Zrika invalid?
What?
Why is the
because
Zrika?
You had a pigul thought.
Well, wait a minute, but aren't we saying that pigul requires a valid Zrika? The whole process has to be valid, has to be kosher?
Yes.
Isn't that a requirement for pigul? Everything
100%.
So then how can we use the pigul thought to say that the Zrika invalid and then say it's pigul?
No. Well, because there are two aspects to it. The question is, do we say, well, remember, in the end, Rav Gidl's thought is rejected. So you're absolutely right. We do, in fact, in the end, say that the Zrika with a pigul thought is a valid Zrika. Because we reject Rav Gidl's statement in the name of Rav. So you're absolutely right. Right? The thought was that Rav Gidl had in the name of Rav was that because it's a pigul Zrika, yes, it's going to make the meat pigul. But does it do the other things that an ordinary Zrika would do? And the answer that Rav Gidl was offering in the name of Rav was no. But you're right. In the end, we say that it does do the things that a Zrika is supposed to do. So again, Rav Gidl's approach was rejected. All right, so let's see if we can just do a little bit longer. Again, we started a little late. Let's see if we can do just a little bit more. So, Boimine, Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rabbi Zera. So, Rabbi Yirmiyah asked Rabbi Zera, this is a question. We know that after the Shavuot Shlomim have been slaughtered, they become connected to the bread. So that if one is lost, the other must be destroyed. But now that we've clarified that the bread is not fully connected until after the blood has been thrown, the Gemara wonders whether there's a way to make the Shavuot Shlomim edible if the loaves get lost between the slaughter and the throwing of the blood. Okay, so Boimine Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Azera. You slaughtered the lambs correctly, but now you lost the bread. Can you Can you throw the blood with the wrong intention and now be able to eat the animal? Because after all, the animal was a shlomim. So let's throw the blood with the wrong intention. Therefore, we'll disconnect the bread from the shlomim. And now, who cares that we lost the bread? We have a valid shlomim. It's not the shlomim for the shtei alechem, but we're going to need to do that all over anyway because we lost the bread. So can we somehow save the meat in this way? So Amrle, yesh l'cha davar she'enu kasher lishmo, but kasher shelo lishmo. 1 second. Is there any time that we have something where if you do it with the proper intention, it's not kosher, and you do it with the wrong intention, it is kosher? Is that ever true? So of course you can't do that. So 1 second, Velo, what are you talking about? Of course there is a case where you can do something improperly and it end up being kosher, and if you do it properly, it's not kosher. V'harei Pesach kodem chatzos. When are you supposed to bring the korban Pesach? Afternoon. Well, what happens if you bring the korban Pesach before noon? Well, you know what happens? If you have the intention of a korban Pesach, it's invalid. But if you have the intention, a wrong intention, you have the intention for any other korban, well, then you know what that korban Pesach turns into? It turns into a shlomim, and it's kosher. So de'eno kosher lishmo, the kosher shelo lishmo, and yet it becomes kosher if you have it not intended. So that's exactly our case. Why not allow it to be done here on Shavuot? No, what I meant to say is the following. Yesh l'cha davar shenira lishmo. It was originally worked if you did it appropriately. Nidcham lishmo. And now it's such that it no longer works if you do it appropriately. Ve'eno kosher lishmo. And now it won't be kosher if you do it intentionally. But kosher shelo lishmo. And it will be kosher if you do it not intentionally. That's what I meant. Below, I can give you another example. Pesach achar zmano b'shar yemos hashana. Well, think about a korban Pesach not before Chatzos, but after Pesach. You have a korban Pesach. You forgot to bring it. Oh my gosh. But now it's after Pesach. It's not going to be valid for the next Pesach because it's still got to be under the age of 1. So there's no way it can be valid for the next Pesach. But you know what you can do with it? If you have in mind a korban Pesach on the first day of ER, it's going to be an invalid korban. But if you know what? If you have in mind any other korban, now that former korban Pesach turns into a korban shlomim and it's valid. So here we have an example of something that was once kosher if it worked, but not kosher if you didn't do the right thing, namely Erev Pesach after Chatzos. If you have in mind the right thing, it works. And if you have in mind the wrong thing, it doesn't work. And now, after Pesach, you know what? It's the reverse. If you have in mind the wrong thing, it works. And if you have in mind the right thing, it doesn't work. So that's exactly just like the case of the lambs on Shavuot. No, it's not. Hachi kamina. Here's what I meant. Yesh l'cha davar shenir lishmo. It was something that worked if you had the right intention. V'nishchat l'shmo. And you know what else? You also slaughtered it already. The korban Pesach examples, the animal wasn't slaughtered yet. Here, though, we're dealing with a situation where the lambs were already slaughtered, and then the bread was lost, and so now we have a real problem. So v'nidcha milishmo, and now it's no longer in the category of being in its own sake because the lambs lost the bread. Right, the bread is now lost even after the lambs became connected to the bread. The eno kasher lishmo, and now if you bring it with the right intention, it's going to be not kosher, not valid. The kasher shelo lishmo, and now if you bring it with the wrong intention, it will be kosher. Is there any case like that? You know what? The Gemara puts it again. Below, yes, there is such a case. V'harei toda. There's a toda where if you have, brings us full circle to the question that Kenneth began the conversation when we had before we started the recording about whether or not this is also about the toda. And there is. Here's an aspect of the toda that's different. Maybe we should say that just like the toda, if you have a toda and now you lose the loaves and you slaughtered the toda, so it's connected to the loaves, but now you lost the loaves. You know what you can still do with that toda? You can turn it into a shlomim. You can you could throw the blood shalol lishmo, meaning not for the purposes of a toda, and magically even though you no longer have the loaves, the meat itself will still be kosher as a shlomim. So shouldn't we use that as the model to allow us to eat the two shlomim on Shavuot if you slaughter them properly and then you lose the bread? Shouldn't we be allowed to do the same thing with respect to the shlomim on Shavuos? And the answer is no. Shiny Toda derachmana karya shlamim. When it came to the Toda, it has both aspects of a Toda to it and a shlamim to it. And so as a result, when you lose the loaves, it can still be it can go and convert itself into a shlamim, and it'll just be a shlamim. And you can have it without the loaves. On the other hand, when it comes to the shtei alechem and the kvasim on Shavuot, you don't have that possibility. The shtei halechem and the kvasim are totally tied together, and they cannot be untied once they're tied together. And so once you slaughter it, if you lose the loaves, you are stuck, and we are going to have to pick up from there with another brisa, still talking about the shlomim and the loaves, God willing, tomorrow. Wishing you all a
Can we
Shabbat
replace the
Shalom.
loaves like we learned
Sorry?
the other day? I thought we learned the other day they can replace the loaves, right?
Not after you slaughter. That
Oh,
once you have the zika of the connecting of the animal and the bread, it's too late. You can't replace the loaves. That's exactly right.
but if we're saying that the zrika is part of the equation, then can't we
The
replace the?
zrika is part of the sanctification of the loaves. Again, this is all according to Rebbe. This is according to Rebbe, right? According to you make an important point. This question that we're asking right now is effectively only according to Rebbe, who says that the shechita itself does affect some sanctification. Um, uh, according
Right,
to
Rava.
Rebbe Lazar, Rebbe Shimon, who disagrees with Rebbe and says that there is no sanctification without the zrika. So he would say that sure, if you lost the loaves, just get new loaves before the zrika, and you'll be okay. At least you could argue that he would say that. Not completely clear, but it would seem that you could do that.
I know we there was a Gemara yesterday. We talked about three scenarios. The loaves were lost, they were broken, and they became tame. And we said the
Yep.
tzitz is maratze, the tame, so that the loaves could be used
All
or
of
not.
that effectively went like Rebbe, and not like Rebbe Lazar, but Rebbe Shimon. All of that it would only be consistent according to Rebbe.
Who said we could not replace the loaves?
Correct.
Uh, except in the case of tame, you could use.
Except in the case of Tame, we don't have to worry
Yeah,
about it
right. The
because it's
loaves are
just
there.
valid. Correct. Correct.
The loaves are there.
Correct. That's exactly right. Because it's clear that according to that Gemara, the Zika definitely happens according at Shechita. There is definitely a connection that happens at Shechita, and it seems like the statement that we had of Rabbi Yochanan about that also all seems to be consistent with Rebbe as opposed to Rebbe Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon.
So there is some connection, and then they have kedushat
Kedusha is
guf.
according to Rava, which again I presume is how we paskin because I don't think this is one of the exceptions. So there would be kedusha as a guf, full kedusha as a guf
At which point at shchita,
at shchita, correct.
and therefore you could not put
You could not replace it if you
man,
lose one of them, it's all gone, and you have to start over from scratch.
and they would not have kedushat mammon, right? Kedushat
Correct.
mammon.
They would not have kedushas mamon. It would have kedushas aguf, and there's no redemption possibility. And the bottom line is that if anything goes wrong, you have to start over from scratch. All right.
There's no redemption, and therefore there would be no issue of meila.
if you tried to redeem them and you took some coins and said, I want to use these coins to redeem it, those coins would not be subject to Me'ilah because they have
Right,
no sanctity whatsoever. Because
right,
the effort to redeem the bread didn't work because the bread has Kedushas Haguf.
right. Okay.
All right,
There
shkach.
was a lot. There was a lot to unpack here, and I'm not
Oh,
sure I could. I'm not sure. I mean, it was a lot of back and forth, and I'm not sure
correct,
that I
correct.
captured everything. I mean, I'm.
Yes, this is definitely a Gemara that you got to review over in order to really take ownership of 100%. Wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom. Wonderful to see you all. Have a great Shabbos. Looking forward to continuing our learning together.
What day? What time you learning next to Monday and Tuesday?
I presume. Oh, that's a great question. Please take a look on the WhatsApp because I believe that Dove is going to lead those days, and so I need to check. He needs to chime in. Excellent question. We'll keep an eye out on the WhatsApp.